Here, hidden in the mud of no man's land, is the indigenous sniper, Henry Norwest. With 115 confirmed kills in the First World War, he lays at a suitable distance, always controlled, steady, unperturbed, motionless, and quite alone. Can you find him before he finds you?
In anticipation of the 100-year anniversary of World War I and Ducky's passing, we march for World War I veterans. So every year we participate in their Legion March. By the way, who take great pride, that Ducky was born in Fort Saskatchewan. My name is Marilyn Buffalo, and Henry Louis Norwest is my great-grandfather. It was my grandmother that started sharing stories about her father. My grandmother was very guarded in many ways, and a lot of that had to do with her residential school experience, because she was 3 years old when her mother passed away from tuberculosis. So Henry Louis was already enlisted in the First War. It was very painful for my grandmother to talk about this, and was only, I think, in certain occasions that she would share with me. She said all she could remember was that he came to see her and her sisters at the residential school in uniform, and that was the last time she saw him.
One of the personalities within the 50th Battalion was the battalion sniper, Henry Norwest. I'm Colonel Retired Roy Boley, and I'm the curator of the King's Own Calgary Regiment Museum and Archives. Ducky Norwest initially attested to the 3rd Canadian Mounted Rifles, and he attested in Wetaskiwin.
And he enlisted under the name of Henry Louis.
Apparently had some troubles with those folks because he was released 3 months later for misconduct.
The second time that Henry enlisted, he enlisted in Calgary, and he enlisted with the 50th Battalion.
And his occupation is saddler, and it's indicated there's former service there with the Royal Northwest Mounted Police.
And he enlisted under his own name, Henry Norwest.
So he was accepted in 50th Battalion in August of 1915. So that's how he wound up in our battalion.
My name is Anthony Warman. My role here at the Royal Alberta Museum, I am the head of history, and I'm also the curator of military and political history. 50th Battalion was an Alberta unit. It was raised in Calgary, and they would have trained in Calgary. They would have trained at what was called Sarcee Camp. They would have trained for, depending on the year, between 10 and 14 weeks.
Training and tactics, learning how to build field defenses, signaling, messaging, reading ground, reading terrain, intelligence gathering. The full draft of the battalion at full strength went over in October of 1915. When they got to England, they remained in camp for a period of time, and then in the late winter, early spring of 1916, They went over to France and were sent into the line at that time.
So I'm Sergeant Bruce Graham, and I'm the collection manager for the King's Own Cavalry Regiment Museum. Sniping is in its infancy in the First World War. The British go to war with no snipers, and of course Canada follows suit. We follow the British doctrine. And it takes about 6 months, 8 months for the British to realize that their people are not being killed by random rounds being fired, that they're actually being targeted and sniped. So very quickly the British and Canadians have to develop a method to deal with this. And the original snipers aren't snipers as we would know them today.
So they kind of became counter snipers first. And then once the guys got trained in the British schools, right, then they said, hey, this sniping guys are a force multiplier.
And it becomes sort of a war within a war. And that's how things evolve, is they're dealing with other snipers.
So he joins into the battalion and he comes into a line company just as any of the other soldiers would. And Henry Norwest is one of these guys who is ideally suited for that tasking.
What did snipers have to endure during the First World War trench warfare? They would have gone out into no man's land. It is everything that we read in the history books. It is mud. It is putrid water. It is death. It's all the horrors of the First World War. In some cases, it's a perfect hunting ground for someone like Henry.
Ducky Norwest was known for his patience and his skill, and also his cam and concealment. You see here how he's scrimmed his helmet, how he's using hessian and natural foliage to break up his outline. This was taught to him by the British through the British sniping schools, and they would camouflage themselves in these burlap camouflage suits, and they brought that skill with them to the trenches. Norwest was an expert at this. He knew how to camouflage. He could sit in no man's land for days and not be spotted by the enemy.
In one instance in Wheeler's book, they refer to, there was Henry Norwest in no man's land, right close to us.
And he saw this sort of white thing that looked like a rabbit. And the next thing he knew, Henry slid into the trench beside him.
So when Canada went to the Boer War, they had a great issue trying to get weapons from Britain. They got secondhand weapons, they got older pattern weapons. They didn't get the top of the line equipment that they were expecting to get. So they started to produce their own. Went to a guy named Charles Ross, and they produced what was essentially a target rifle modified for use for the military. Turned out to be a complete disaster. Its one really redeeming feature was it was an excellent target rifle. It was incredibly accurate, and the snipers loved it. They had a chance to tune it a little more for them. They mounted a scope on it. They mounted the Warner and Swayze scope. Norwest used a Ross. He actually used 3 Ross rifles that we know of throughout his career. He would shoot so many rounds that he would actually shoot rifles out. The second one is here in the gallery. The third he was using when he was killed. The first was turned over to his family.
There was another instance where he was sniping at some Germans, and he was so careful about how he employed his rifle. Norwest's methods are peculiarly his own. Quote, wait until not a single Hun has a chance of seeing your rifle flash, then get your man. Unquote, is his motto. So he'd gotten one guy, and he figured that his partner was on to Henry Norwest's position. And again, he sat there in no man's land, and he didn't move for 2 days straight. And then he got his shot on the other guy, and he dropped the other guy. Very few men could display the patience employed by Norwest. His indifference to danger and his ability to negotiate practically open ground makes it possible for him to use no man's land as a sniping ground to the fullest advantage. Okay, so that's how the regiment is writing about Henry Norwest.
And they're starting to really record him because he appears multiple times through the war diary. Sniper Norwest made 3 hits here. Sniper Norwest made 2 hits here. They talk about other snipers, but his name appears in a number of places.
And the interesting thing about the war diaries is normally when individuals get mentioned in the war diary, it's normally the officers, maybe the NCOs. Generally, the other ranks don't get mentioned very often. The fact that Norwest gets mentioned twice in the war diary is very, very significant.
That's also because he has the highest number of hits, that he will be recorded more.
But again, he was a guy who kind of kept to himself. And again, depending what source you go by, You know, he goes by the nickname Ducky, which was given to him by his fellow soldiers.
One of his comrades actually told me that he was quite good at ducking out on the girls, and that's where he earned the name of Ducky.
So on the 9th, the 50th Battalion, which is part of the 10th Brigade, part of the 4th Canadian Division, actually did not take part in the attack on the 9th. They took part in the attack on Hill 145 on the 10th of April. Subsequently, on the 12th of April, in the attack on the Pimple, Norwest receives his military medal.
When you read his citation, it's particularly noted for his work on the Pimple and the lives that he saved. August 8th, 1918 is the beginning of the Battle of Amiens. They don't know it at this point in time, but we now in history record it as the last 100 days. We've broken out of trench warfare and a different type of war. The Allies moved a significant amount of territory since the 8th of August. The history records that Henry wasn't supposed to go out. He asked to go.
Norwest is out front. He's with a sniper named Reynolds.
So when they're out trying to engage a German sniper, and by this time Norwest is legendary, and the German snipers are trying to get him.
And he's waiting and he's patient.
Henry and this German sniper were looking at each other.
Ducky's about to squeeze the trigger on a German sniper.
Unfortunately, the other sniper just happens to be a little faster that day than he is. That's the end of Ducky Norwest.
So when the battalion finds out that Ducky's been killed by a German sniper, line comparatively quiet today, excepting for snipers who killed sniper H. Norwest MM and wounded sniper Reynolds in the arm. Our snipers shot 4 of the enemy, and during the afternoon, we had the artillery put a crash shoot on Deadwood where the enemy snipers were located. So you can see what the Army thought of Lance Corporal Norwest. Okay, the battalion said, "You got our guy, we're gonna fix you," and they brought down a whole artillery barrage on one German position for 2 guys.
He was very young when he passed. He was only about 33 years old. His nickname was Yai, and so I would listen when they were talking about him. And with a little sadness come to their eyes, when they would talk about that, the fact that he never came home.
So it said that he was owned by the 50th Battalion. He was claimed by the 10th Brigade. He was loved by the 4th Division. He was admired by the Canadian Corps. He was admired by the British, and he was feared by the Germans.
He was well loved by the rest of the soldiers in the battalion, very highly respected, not just by his fellow soldiers, but by the officers and NCOs as well.
I do know that through interviews that I had with one of his comrades that was in his battalion, he was really, really totally in love with him as a comrade. He could walk into a room and light up the place. That's what he said. So I thought that was really special. So I asked Ted, it says on his grave and his record that he had 115 hits, and he said no, he had way more than that because of his unobserved hits.
Guys like Norwest, Pattison Page, they set the bar here, right? And you're never to go below that bar, right? It's unacceptable to go below that bar because they paid a pretty significant price for it.
Here's a guy who put everything on the line, and First Nations Canadian, went over to fight for Canada to do what he thinks is right, and eventually pays the ultimate sacrifice for it. And what better example can you show young kids today?
I'm Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Hunt, Commanding Officer of the King's Own Calgary Regiment. I think the biggest thing is we try and connect the current generation of soldiers with those veterans and tell their stories. So with Lance Corporal Norwest, he was just a phenomenal soldier. His fieldcraft skills, his marksmanship, the respect he had amongst his comrades. We teach those stories to our soldiers so they understand the examples that they need to live up to. It's particularly important for our soldiers who are from Indigenous communities, for them to see those role models as well. But frankly, he's a role model for the whole regiment.
We try to carry on his memory. things like this, just educating the young, educating the public on not just his experience, but the entire experience of Canada. This was such a monumental moment for Canada, the First World War. You know, Canada goes in as sort of a colony of Britain and comes out as a independent country. And people like that and the people who were there need to be remembered.
The fact that he's a key piece in our gallery, the fact that we have his sniper weapon, it's not only a significant piece of our regimental history, but it's a significant piece of, in my mind, Canadian history. So by making sure that we not only have it, but allow people to see it and tell the story behind it.
Just as a person interested in the history of the First World War, we want to see someone like this recorded so that we don't forget.
To recognizing that, hey, we did make a contribution. First Nations and Métis heroes, Inuit as well, and not only served this country but excelled. I believe that for me personally, I have a responsibility as an educator to make sure that those stories and that legacy is passed down to the younger generations.